We're so happy to have you here in person, and what a wonderful night. My name is Brad Pappas. I'm the new Executive Director of FEI Twin Cities, and I'm thrilled to be at this event. It's great to see our strategic partners here, our members, our board members. We've got some friends from NABA here, so that's great, and of course, my mother is everywhere. And our friends from PDA. So we're great to have you all here. This is going to be a great night. See, whenever I say the word night, the lights go down. Wow. Anyway, we are thrilled to have Bob Ryan here. He's one of the great ones as we learn the stories of navigating the boardroom. And we're excited to have George as our host. So thank you everyone for coming and enjoy.
Well, thanks, Brad. Are we doing okay, mic-wise? All right, good deal. Thank you. Welcome to all of you. Welcome also to FEI chapter members in Boston, Dallas, Chicago, San Diego, Silicon Valley, Orange County, Northeast Ohio, Los Angeles, Arizona, and more. So we're simulcasting this. Welcome. And especially a welcome to our guests and potential members. My name's George Boyadjis. I'm the VP of Membership this year for FEI Twin Cities. So if you've got a guest name, please see me. We can make it happen for you. We can make the magic happen. And we've got a lot of magic to talk about tonight, thanks to this gentleman, Bob Ryan, who has just this incredible career that you'll hear more about, and is going to tell us about that career arc, and also about his role in various boardrooms, navigating the boardroom. You know, when we set this up, we said this is a Hall of Fame event. Well, how do you get Hall of Fame? Well, literally, it's right here. Okay, Bob was an inductee into the FEI Hall of Fame, and so that is the rarest of the rare. I can tell you that. And so we're tremendously honored to have Bob join us tonight. And to set the stage for tonight's conversation, as I mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about his career experiences. This is a guy who is an accidental CFO, an accidental accountant, if you will. And you'll hear that right from him. He started off with an engineering background and passion. And I'm not going to tell Bob's story because he tells it so much better than I ever could. But, you know, Cornell, Harvard Business School, McKinsey, Chief of Staff for Citibank, Union Texas Petroleum, Medtronic, CFO for both of those companies, the boards of General Mills, UnitedHealth Group, Stanley Black Decker, Hewlett-Packard, and I might say the pinnacle was the FEI Hall of Fame, but you know, that's just me. That's just me. I'll leave it to Bob to judge. But our key topics for today are Bob's role as a presenter to the board, and then his role as a board member. We have folks in the audience from the Private Directors Association who are either on boards or seeking board seats. We have folks in the room from FEI who are either CFOs or aspiring to be CFOs or aspiring to be board members. And so we think it's a great way to kind of kick off that whole conversation. And so to get things started, I'd just like Bob to tell us a little bit about your background and how did you know, Bob, you grew up in Detroit in the 60s. So start us from there and take us forward.
Boy, I'll be 80 next year, so there's a lot of years to talk. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah. Good. There we go.
I was born in Detroit in 1943. And I think the best thing I had going for me were two fantastic parents. My dad only went to the 5th grade. He was the 15th of 16 children. And he moved from Montgomery, Alabama to Detroit, Michigan to work in the factories. And he made the round of all the auto plants at the age of 13, 14. Didn't get a full-time job until he was 16. And he lied about his age, got a job. He worked at Chrysler from 16 to 59. And if you can think about almost 40 years in a place and you're not yet 60 years old. And I actually got him to retire. I was a college student, and I went through the retirement formula. And years of service was the biggest variable. But my dad, from the very beginning, said the key to a better life in this world is through education. And he said, I want to tell you what your job is, because you can't do your job unless you know what it is. And your job is good academic grades and good citizenship grades, and you work around the house. And he was just tough. He said, don't ever come to me and tell me you can't do it, because it's your job to figure it out. I can't help you do it. My mother taught me to read and write before kindergarten. I started kindergarten. I could write cursive, which not a lot of 5-year-olds could do. She asked me the first 3-4 days, what did you learn? Didn't like what she heard. And came and took me out and put me in the Catholic schools, and my parents were Baptist. So I had just a wonderful start and a wonderful foundation. My dad also laid out, think about your career should be number 1, where you make the most money, number 2, the greatest job security, and number 3, the least amount of racism. So the Russians had put up a satellite, Sputnik, and there was a big cry for engineers. I said, okay, I'll be an engineer. And so I got my first degree in electrical engineering. I worked the summers for Detroit Edison in plant management. I hated the work, and it's great work, but it just didn't fit me. And I didn't know what to do, so I ended up went to Cornell in the PhD program. And I get a year into it, and I was doing well academically, but I just didn't want to do the work. And I made a decision, I'm going to try. I use this on my children as they're growing up. You don't want to live a life of regret. And my definition of a life of regret is you have one time in your life to do something and you don't do it. And you'll look back for many years and say, boy, my life would have been different had I done X. So I applied to business school. And it took me a long time to tell my dad I was going to go. And when I told him, he said, if I were picking a career for you, that's the last career I'd pick. And he said, because his view is business was done in golf course and in the country clubs, and I'd be excluded. But I loved it from the day I started. And racism was an issue, which I learned to deal with, because the African-American percentage at Harvard Business School in my first year was less than 3%. The year before, it was 1%. And if you'd gone back 3 or 4 years before that, it was 1 student out of 1,500. So that was a learning experience. But I loved it, and I loved everything that I did after that. And I came out, and I worked for McKinsey. Great job. You learn how to handle yourself in high-level meetings. You learn how to write and give presentations. I love the job. I did that for 5 years. Then when we started a family, I went to work for Citibank, and I was chief of staff for the president and chairman of the bank. And I did that for a while, and I may be close, but not yet 30, and there was no next job for me, because that was the highest level staff job in the bank. So I went to Walter Wriston, who was chairman of the bank, and I said, I need to do something. I want to get into corporate finance. And he said, well, tell me what do you have to do to do that. And my one criticism of Harvard Business School, which I would have maybe even today, not as much, they don't do a really great job of teaching accounting. And so what I said was, I don't really feel like I learned accounting. You can't really learn it via the case method. You've got to sit down and you've got to do T accounts and you've got to do double entry bookkeeping to really, truly understand it. So I was pulled out of that job, and I went into a training course, to Citibank's accounting class, which is where I really learned the nuts and bolts of accounting. And then I managed the department that lent to the broadcasting and cable TV industry. It was a very deal-intensive business. I can remember getting a call one day from someone in Alaska. And they said, we'd like you to come to Anchorage and testify before the Public Utilities Commission that Citi will finance the building of a cable TV franchise. So I love that. So that was where I really began my love of, I would call it, I want to say corporate finance, but it was really much more, if you look at what a CFO does, it's much more the treasury side of what a CFO does. And I did that for a while. Then I got hired to become the treasurer of Allied Corporation, which became Allied Signal, which became Honeywell. So we struck a deal that I would go to Texas and become treasurer of the oil and gas subsidiary, which was 80% of Allied's earnings and cash flow. And this was a fantastic company. They had huge oil reserves in the North Sea, huge reserves in Indonesia, some reserves in Pakistan, the onshore and offshore US. So I did that as treasurer. And I've had a couple of times in my life where I made a decision that I thought was really smart, and my whole life would have been different if I hadn't done it, and I was forced to do it. I was approached by the CFO of the company. He said, Bob, I want you to take the controller's job. I said, I have no interest in that. I thought the work was dull. I thought the people were not interesting. I thought...
No one in this room. No one.
No, honestly,
These are people down in Houston. Yeah, no one in this room.
And I honestly thought that they were bound by rules, and I just wasn't interested. And so finally, Bill Geitz, who was the chairman of the company, called me in, and he said, Bob, he said, you're not promotable unless you do this job. He said, I'm going to put you in whether you want to do it or not. So I came home, I told my wife, and my wife always worried about me. She always felt, she said, you're the only black person in senior management. I really wonder if they're not trying to get rid of you. And I said, well, I don't know. I don't think so. But I said, I'll try it. It turned out to be an absolutely fantastic job. I mean, I came to love the people. I loved the work. I learned so much. And this was a time when I was, saved for myself. And I think that, and one of the things I learned, and I do say this, I mentor a lot of young students of color. And one of the things I tell them is there's some things you can control and some things you can't control. And I said, race is an issue, and it should be less of an issue in this country today than it is. But on the other hand, if somebody runs an organization, their self-interest has to be involved as well. And they can't put a person in that they don't think can do the job, because it can happen, but you've got to understand that it doesn't always happen that way. So that was an absolutely fantastic job. And so I was treasurer for a year, I was controller for a year, then I was in the CFO's job. Well, then I'm making plans to move from Houston to Morristown, New Jersey, to become treasurer of the parent company. When all of a sudden, they decided they want to sell the oil and gas business. Now, Ed Hennessy was the CEO of the company, and he said, that's a commodity business. I don't want to be in a commodity business. I want a growth business. So the deal that was struck was that KKR bought half of the company. Now, KKR would typically never do a deal like this because they want control. But the way they did it is because they got a great price on it. And so that really offset them having lack of control. So I spent maybe, this started off for me 8 years of experience that was truly, you couldn't have paid for it. It started off, we had to raise, and I don't even remember how much, it was over $1 billion. It was the largest deal that KKR had done at that point in time.
You took them public, right?
We took them and then made them private again. They started off private,
Okay.
and then we took them public after that.
Got it.
And so what we did is we then had to mount a roadshow. So we took, what you can't even do today, we took the Concorde to, first we started all over the U.S. Then we went to Connecticut and met with all the insurance companies. And then we took the Concorde to Europe and a roadshow all over. And these were all things I'd never done before, but you just had to figure out how to do it. And I was telling George, asking him, he said, Bob, are you ready? I said, well, do I have a choice? And when we'd have to do these roadshows, there were always 3 speakers. And I was always on the hot seat because people always wanted to know the numbers. And so Clark Johnson, who was CEO of the company, he would say, we're here and I'm CEO of the company, but if you have any question on the numbers, Bob will answer those. So I was immediately on the hot seat, and you have to learn how to deal with that. But for me, the thing that was great is I love the work. And so I jumped in and learned. So we took the Concorde to Europe. We did a major deal. And at the time that we closed that deal, I'll never forget, West Texas Intermediate was $28.70 a barrel. Within 9 months, we were selling oil, North Sea, all over the world at less than $10 a barrel. And we laid off a third of the workforce in a day.
Wow.
And that was the worst day of my life, because these are people I had hired, telling them how great the company was going to be and what opportunities there were, and all of a sudden, we're firing them. But we had no choice. And I will tell you, KKR, these are some of the smartest guys. To start off, I spent, I don't even remember, 4 or 5 weeks in their office in San Francisco preparing the offering memorandum. And you had George Roberts, Jerry Kohlberg, and Henry Kravitz. They were the 3. And they actually invented leveraged buyouts. They were the first to really do this. They were all 3 working for Bear Stearns, left Bear Stearns. I think took clients and other things with them that they maybe, I'm not sure how all that went. But in fact, they are huge even today. So we had to restructure the balance sheet. We had to sell assets. We had to do all sorts of things. And I'm in a position where I was bankrupt at this point. But at the end of the day, this worked out incredibly well. And once we recovered from all these things, we then took the company public. So then I'll never forget, we had to do another whole round of roadshows to take the company public. We got all of that done. And I can remember landing, and we closed out the roadshow in New York. We gave our last presentation. Then I get a call from a guy on the phone. Says, Bob, it's Dick Grasso. I'm chair of the New York Stock Exchange. I've assigned Marcus Schloss and Company as your specialist. I had no idea what a specialist did. And so, I mean, I knew a little, but not a lot. So I did some research, and I visited a couple of companies that loved their specialists and some that hated them. And I sat on the floor of the exchange with Marcus Schloss for a week. And that's where I really learned what they do and how all of that works. And it was a wonderful experience. And I had so many ups and downs along the way, things you would never have expected to happen. I'll tell you one, and if this gets too long, let me know, and I can obviously shorten this.
Sure.
But one year, I would just get things thrown to do. And one year, I got responsibility for insurance. Now, to understand what Union Texas did, we had huge reserves in Indonesia, LNG, that was sold to the Japanese under long-term contract. And you have an LNG tanker, which is back in those days, it cost $40 or $50 million to build an LNG tanker. And there was a thought about bringing this kind of fuel into Boston Harbor. Well, someone did a study and said, if one of these tankers blows up, it'll take out the whole harbor, which gives you a sense of how explosive that is. So one year I got responsibility for insurance. And I said, well, I don't know a lot about insurance. So I said, I'm going to do a study. And I hired a firm, and my opinion was, or my thought was that companies pay for insurance that they don't need. And my thought here was that we don't have enough money for oil and gas exploration. Let's try to free up cash to do it, to help the company. So we did study, and we found 5 or 6 opportunities to scale back insurance and save money. But we found one that was just total luck. We had business interruption insurance in the North Sea, and we had huge reserves in the Piper Claymore fields. And the insurance was for a given amount or 18 months, whichever came first. Well, in our study, we found that you couldn't use that amount in 18 months. So I just said to the underwriter, well, how about if you make the 18 months 36 months? And without even responding, they said, yeah, we'll do that. And so I got to understand how Lloyd's works. A lot of them don't understand what they're truly insuring. So we signed all of this in April. And I'm sitting in a dentist chair in August, and my wife calls. And she said, oh, they're calling you from the North Sea, and there's a problem. I said, well, it's probably a compressor or something that's blown up. Now, we were not the operator, but we owned, I think, a third of it was a huge field. It turned out the whole platform was lost. About 600 people were killed. And basically, a gas leak in the floor of the North Sea had ignited, and the whole platform just melted. And so we were the only company that were totally insured. And it was interesting because my first concern was that the market would not look upon us favorably, because the insurance we had was business interruption. So you basically paid the earnings that you would have had in that 36-month period, but by the same token, you still have the reserves that you'll produce at a later point. And nobody picked that up. But we had all of those sorts of issues, but every single year there was something totally different. I was with Medtronic with Union Texas I was CFO, I think, for 11 or 12 years. And once we'd gotten to the point, the company had done really well, the stock price had done well, and I decided I was going to sell my stock and just take 2 years and not do anything. Now, my wife was not at all.
I can't imagine. I'm sorry. I can't imagine Bob not doing anything for a 2-year period.
But I thought that it sounded like a good idea at the time. And I thought I would do that. And I started talking to Medtronic, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to join Medtronic. And this is another time where I was saved for myself in a way. I'd started this negotiation with Bill George, and he was trying to, he was trying to get me interested in what Medtronic does. So the first thing he said was, I'd like you to spend a couple of days with a Medtronic rep. Well, you think of a Medtronic rep as a salesperson. These are not salespeople in the way you think. They're on call 24 hours a day. The physician will call and say, I have a procedure, pacemaker, defibrillator, heart valve that's going to go in tomorrow at 8 a.m. We need you there. The rep has to be there. They have to help program the device once it's in. It's a very sophisticated job. So I was kind of feeling better about it, but I couldn't make up my mind quite to do it. Then all of a sudden, we at this point had done a public offering. KKR owned 40%, Allied owned 40%, the public owned 20%. At this point, Allied wants to sell theirs, so I worked out a deal, and one of my really good friends, he and I were classmates together, was Hank Paulson, who at the time was the CEO of Goldman Sachs. So I called Hank, and we worked out an arrangement where if KKR would agree to a standstill, we could sell Allied stock. Well, then that meant another massive roadshow. And I had already said I was leaving. So then the CEO came back and said, Bob, if you leave, then the problem becomes we have a new CFO. And the issue becomes, well, where's Bob and not the deal that we want to get done. So I then went back to Bill George and Medtronic and said, Bill, I'm going to withdraw from Medtronic. And he said, well, we haven't made an offer, but if you're interested, we'll stop our search and we'll talk in a couple of months. And that persuaded me to join Medtronic. And it would have been a horrible thing if I had not. And then Medtronic was a whole another 13, 14 years of tremendous growth. And stock price is not the only measure, but revenue and earnings would have followed this pattern. The week I joined, the stock was around $4 a share. If you adjust for splits, when I retired 13, 14 years later, it was at 62 and change. We acquired companies in the diabetes space, interventional cardiology space. The company grew tremendously. And I was amazed at the things I had done before that came back when I came to Medtronic. And the first board I ever served on, I was in 1990, was a Tico Energy, Tampa Electric Company. And they needed, what they needed was they had, Union, Texas had reserves in the San Juan Basin of New Mexico. It was coal seam reserves. And what happens is you drill into the coal seam and you inject water and it releases methane gas. And there were very sophisticated tax regulations and benefits around that. And so I knew a lot about that. Well, Tampa Electric had the same reserves in the Black Warrior Basin of Alabama. And they wanted someone on their board who understood. So I went in with a very, very narrow set of expectations. And but then they also just wanted someone who could sit on the audit committee. And once they got to know me, I had done so many things in Union, Texas. My experience was so much broader that I then became a very different kind of board member. And today, I think you couldn't be a board member, a really good board member who comes in with a very narrow set of expertise, because there are changes in what's expected of a board member.
So, Bob, you've taken us into the boardroom
Right.
there, but one of the things that I'd like you to talk to the audience about is your first experience coming into the Medtronic boardroom as CFO, and that very first presentation, if you will, to the Medtronic board.
Well, it's interesting. You have to figure out how you want to communicate, whether it's a board or anybody. And one of the reasons that I think I did pretty well with roadshows is you've got to understand the audience that you're dealing with. And if you're dealing with the street, you've got the buy side, you've got the sell side. They're very different. And you don't communicate, you have to understand where they're coming from. And the first week that I joined Medtronic, we had a board meeting. And the controller got up and he made a presentation. And within 10 minutes, he had totally lost control of the meeting. Someone jumped on this number, somebody on that number, somebody on a different number. And so at the middle of the meeting, Bill George gets up and he walks, and the poor guy, he's nervous about the meeting anyway. And Bill hands me a note. And in the note he says, "You will do all these meetings in the future." And so I said to Bill, well, I can't do them the way he does them. And so my approach to dealing with the board is this. This will be a gross generalization. But you have two kinds of people in the audience. You've got some board members who read and they look at every number. They make sure the numbers foot. They do ratios. They do all sorts of stuff. Then you've got other board members who say, you know the numbers. You know the company. You should tell us what's important. So my approach was to say to the board on my first presentation, there are a lot of numbers here, and we'll get into whatever level of detail you want, but there are X number of things that I'd like you to carry away. And that X can't be much more than about 3. You can't say there are 20 things I want you to carry away. And the way I always did in giving a roadshow presentation is to say up front, I want you to leave with these 3 points, 1, 2, and 3. And then as you go through the presentation, you'll say this was the first point. And then you do another, you say this was the second, and this was the third. Then at the end, you put up the chart you started with, don't even repeat it, and then and I've seen people afterwards who'll remember the 3 things or the 4 things, but it can't be a lot. So and this is one of the things with boards, you have to, it's difficult to navigate within the boardroom, and there are ways to deal with that. It occurred to me as when I retired from the Stanley Black Decker board 18 months or so ago, they asked if I would interview every board member and then summarize what I got out of the discussions. And some of it is, how do you conduct the meeting? And what the CEO had certain things he wanted, and I can come back to this if you want later. But
So when Bob first told me that story about his first board meeting at Medtronic, it really resonated with me because I had kind of a similar experience, but I was the controller for the company. And my CFO had just been fired. And, but he stayed around to help me prepare for that meeting. And I had the 120 slides of points that I was going to make. And he gave me the same advice that Bob just gave us. George, focus on three things to take away. And if you do that, and you've got 120 slides, so you know all the detail. You can answer any detailed question that there is. But just focus on the three things you think they need to walk out of the room with. And so I really appreciated that.
And the one thing, if you start off the meeting that way, that will shut everybody up until you get those three things. But it also puts the monkey on your back to have the three right things, the three important things. Yeah. So you take on some responsibility, but you quiet down your audience. But you really got to know what you're talking about. And I think you've got to really be able to synthesize a lot of stuff into what's really, really important.
Yeah. So you've taken us into the boardroom now for a couple of the companies. You've served on 5 Fortune 500 boards and several others. You've seen effective board meetings. You've seen board meetings less effective. From your point of view, what are the keys to being an effective board member?
Okay. Before I do that, I'll say you have to think about the board you want to go on, and you've got to do some due diligence on that board. Yeah. I made one huge mistake that turned out to be just an absolute disaster. I got a call from the search firm who said, "Would you be willing to serve on the board of Hewlett-Packard?" And I knew the company, but just in general. And I said, "That sounds great." The very next day, the CEO called me, and she said, "We have, you all aware of this, what you call the SEC would call a financial expert." And she said, "We only have one financial expert on the board, and she's going in the hospital for some serious cancer surgery. And we need a financial expert to come in and chair and run the audit committee." So I agreed instantly. I mean, I jumped right into the substance of it. And I agreed instantly to do that. Well, that was a big mistake because this is where governance comes into play. And I'm arguing that there are some things that have become more important over time, and governance is one of them. And I'm not saying you have to be a governance expert and know that in detail. But let me tell you the things that go wrong here. We are shareholders. If you're a board member, you are a board member for the shareholders. You are not a board member for the CEO. And I say on boards, you got to be really careful here because you see the CEO, you know that if you have to change them out or something they don't want, you see the human side of that. But what you don't see is the human side of the shareholders who are suffering if bad decisions get made. And so once day one, the first day I was on the board, I chaired the audit committee that day. And what I could learn was there were 2 board members who thought they were the CEO's representative on the board. And right away, I could see that this board was split and was fractured. And I actually went on, I told George, this morning I went online to read about this. But the scandals that came as a result of this and the hurt of the employees and the shareholders were truly, truly unbelievable. We had massive fighting among board members. I don't know if any of you have heard of pretexting. Does anybody hear? Well, time has passed and it's kind of what it is, but we had a case where the board, you had factions and you had some that just couldn't relate to each other. And I didn't know any of this until I was actually on the board. We had a case where the board had a strategic offsite, and much of what was talked about got leaked in the Silicon Valley publication. So the board asked the chair the board to determine where this leak had come from. So she then hired an outside firm, and they did something called pretexting. And what pretexting is, I call up the phone company, and I say, I'm George Boyadjis, and I'd like a list of all the calls I made last month. And so whoever they hired did that. Well, I mean, now, once we found out it was done, the lawyer said, well, it's not illegal unless you pretext for financial information, but it looks awful. So and the bottom line is we were able to figure out who had leaked. But we come into a board meeting, and this gets presented, and the board asked this person to resign. Well, his friend on the board stands up, slams his briefcase shut, and says, I quit. And he walked out. Well, then I'm chair of the audit committee. I have E&Y come in so that we prepare, I think it's an S8, as to why he left. And then we actually called him and confirmed with him. And you can read all of this. There's a very, very long New Yorker article, which I'd forgotten about, which I read again this morning. And then we called, and he said, as long as you don't say I'm retired, I'm trying to be with my family, I don't care what you write. So we then do that. Well, he then decides he wants to get back at the chair of the board who did this. So he calls the SEC and says the S8 is inaccurate. It doesn't reflect. So all of a sudden, the SEC is in interviewing all of us, and depositions are being taken. Then he calls an attorney, who's a law professor at Georgetown, and he gets involved and says, well, that was illegal. Pretexting was illegal. And all of a sudden, the FBI comes in. And it was an absolute mess. There's a House subcommittee was involved. The CEO of the company was on, I watched him for 3 hours being testified online on national TV. And during this time, the company is doing nothing. Nothing is being done. And this just went on and on and on, and finally the board terminates the CEO, who I think was the right decision, absolutely the right decision. Then we hire, it becomes difficult to get a great CEO when you're fighting with your current CEO. So we get, and he was actually quite good in a lot of ways, but he then had a relationship with a woman who had previously in her life been a softcore porn actress, and she claimed that he sexually harassed her. Well, then the board just came apart on this, and you had factions. And I will say on this one, I was in a faction, because basically what had happened is the board, she made an allegation, and the board was to interview her to find out what substance was behind this. Well, he meets with her on the morning the board's to see her, makes a payment, and she doesn't see us. And I take a very strong position. You'll never, if you can buy your way out of a problem, you can never have anything that's fair. It's just not right. But there were members of the board who didn't agree. So it was a disaster all. And the company and the employees and the shareholders suffered greatly throughout all of this. So my point being, the way the process should have worked, if I would say to any of you who are thinking to go on a board, I would get involved in governance. And I don't mean to be an expert, but you need to know, for example, how does the board deal with executive sessions? Does the audit committee and finance committee meet with the auditors without management there? All those sorts of things you need to know. You need to understand the difference between managing versus oversight. How does all of this work? All of those things need to be, but basically, the director should not be a director for a given employee. And the way the process should have worked is the Nominating Governance Committee should have said, the board needs to assess the skills that it has and needs to assess the skills that it doesn't have. And then from that, the board then needs to say, we have X people in this and Y in that and Z in this, but we need 2 people in this area or 1 in this area. And that should begin the process. And that should be driven by the Nominating Governance Committee, not by the board. Or not by the CEO. Not by the CEO.
So when we were preparing for this conversation, Bob was concerned about what he could talk about, right? And he referenced earlier that he went online earlier today to make sure that everything he's saying now is already in the public domain. and he's not telling any tales out of school. But that had to be extraordinarily challenging.
Oh, I mean, it was.
You didn't sign up for that, right?
Well, there are a couple of things. but there are some things that I didn't sign up for that were really difficult that I liked. When I was on the board of Citibank, Citi had gone through, they were basically cited by the SEC and the OCC, and they were under compliance for mortgage lending. So I was asked to put together several board members, and we were to be sure. There was a big thick book that had over 200 deliverables that Citi had to deliver to the OCC and to the Federal Reserve. And had to make sure that we were moving along to do that. That took a huge amount of work, but I didn't mind that. HP stuff I found really difficult. I found the things where people were not honest, where people were fighting, and you never knew from what people said to what they really meant. I found that to be really debilitating.
Yeah.
But and with HP, even still, the market doesn't really know. I mean, the way the company's governance was set, I chaired the audit committee. A woman named Lucy Salhaney chaired nominating and governance. And what they ask is that for Lucy and I to basically get immersed in the information, understand it, and be sure the board got to see it all. So between the CEO and this woman he had hired, we read every single email, and so we knew exactly what happened. It's not exactly what got in the press, but it was just, we had board meetings that went to 10, 11 at night. It was very, very stressful.
Wow. I can only imagine. So you've served on multiple boards. Mm-hmm. You've served in management roles at the highest levels of finance in an organization. Talk to us a little bit about that differentiation, about the difference between the management role and the board's role, and how you crosswalk between those two, if you will.
Well, I think that when you think about doing due diligence, you ought to be sure the board you're thinking about going on knows the difference between management and oversight. And so, because and I think it's very perilous if the board. Well, let me back up and say my theory is that the board members are not smarter than management, and you'd be crazy to think you are. But what you bring is, number one, great experience, and number two, you bring perspective, that you can step back and take a broader view of things. And if you get involved too much, then you lose your sense of perspective, and that makes it not work well. So I'll give you an example, and you really have to. I recommend to the Harvard Business School, the dean of the business school, that in their executive education, they have cases, because it's almost through examples that you kind of learn how this works. But we had a General Mills, I chaired the finance committee at General Mills. And you're all familiar with enterprise risk management. A lot of stuff gets thrown to the lap of the finance organization. So enterprise risk management is a couple things. You look at every risk that the company has, and you got to be sure that you got a process that gathers that everywhere. And then you want to look at the size of it and the probability of it. And you can do your XY graph and kind of what's in that upper right-hand quadrant is what you want to deal with. Well, first time we did that, several board members said, oh, we got to get involved in this and make sure the company does this, and they do this, and they do this. And I said, that's not our job. And we went around and around, and we really didn't quite reach agreement. So we pulled in the general counsel. And they said, look, this is really the job, and we all did agree on this, is that management oversight has to be, you have to have a process. And it has to be a process that you're confident will get at the big risks. Have you talked to all the people who know about the risk? Have you done all the things to really get all those on the table? Then secondly, how have you gone about evaluating that risk? Then how have you gone about remediating it? And this is where you have this discussion between the board and between management, back and forth, and so that management makes the board really comfortable that they've really thought it through well, what they've got works. Then at the end of the day, the board has to make a decision. If you think management's done this in a way, I'll put it a different way. Let's say you think the board hasn't done it. And let's say you think the company's at risk for surviving. Well, that's your job. You better bring that up and be sure that's dealt with. But so that gives you a sense in that one example of doing the work versus oversight of the work. And I think that's something that, I think that's an issue if you think about going on a board, but it's also an issue if you're on a board. When I finished I was on Stanley Black Decker a long time. I was first on the board of Black Decker, then when they merged, I stayed on the combined company. And I had a really And why the board, I don't know who thought of this idea, they said, Bob, why don't you interview every director? And I talked to every director for at least an hour and some a couple of hours. And then I summarized it on one page. And I went back and looked at that. And maybe if you, I don't want to come here and read things, but I did pull the page out, which I think I'll read to you exactly. It'll give you a sense of kind of what the CEO was feeling. What the CEO said he'd like to do, he said, I'd like to change the structure of our board meetings. And I would like to kick off every meeting and just tell the board what I'm thinking. It may not be something that I'm going to do, but it's a thought. And this is what we agreed. Number one, that every board member would listen carefully before responding. Number two, respond in a manner that helps provide oversight, but not say, this is what I would do. Because that's a problem for boards. And it's very difficult to get 9, 10, 11 people with different backgrounds, with everyone saying, I do this, and you get everyone running at it a different way. And then thirdly, that it was a board member's job to encourage the CEO to be comfortable raising items that are preliminary and items that can be negative. Don't just bring up positive things.
So one of the things that we talked about earlier, is this issue of working through difficult issues in the boardroom, and when the board members have a sense that the CEO may be going in a direction. I'm not talking about the Hewlett-Packard situation. That's like,
that was
yeah. But you shared some other examples of how boards can influence the direction of the company, obviously, through conversations with the CEO, when you have a sense that the CEO may not be going in the direction that the rest of the board wants to go. Can you talk a little bit about some of that kind of situation?
This was one that was pretty interesting with General Mills. I chaired the finance committee for a long time, and your job is to look at risk to the company, among other things. And we analyzed General Mills compared to everybody in our space. Companies are similar in the same industry space. And one of the things that we saw over time is that companies were getting rid of their defined benefit pension plans. And so what we did as a committee, we worked with management to lay out the risk you take with that, and to lay out that we're becoming more and more a minority in this. But then you look at the CEO. I mean, the employees love the defined benefit pension plan. And he didn't want to take away something that employees loved. So I think that what you have to do is you've got to figure out how do you want to raise. So what our committee did is in executive session, we all talked about this. The CEO wasn't there. We talked about the issue, and we talked about how we wanted to deal with it. Then we took that the next day at our full board meeting. And we all agreed that I was chair of the committee, that I would sit down with the CEO. Because you don't want to bring the CEO and have 5 people on the other side of the table. So we did that. And he was kind of resisting. And so we did it again a year later, and it had moved a little bit differently. And, we'd gotten even more of a minority. And finally, I went through it again. And he finally looked at me and he said, well, yeah, he said, Bob, I got it. But then we did one more thing, which I think was helpful, is we laid out for him, we said, look, we understand your relationship with employees. We spent a lot of time with Fidelity and with Vanguard, and we said, let's get people in to educate the employees and let them get involved so they know that we are giving them a responsibility. You don't just dump it in their lap and say, okay, we've taken care of you all these years, now you take care of yourself. You've got to give them some perspective, give them some education so that they understand how to do that. And so he didn't just go to the employees and say, we're taking it away. We did that, and we gave him some options. You could phase it out over time. And I think it's important to do these things early before they become a crisis. And that's part of the reason that you're a board, is to look out. That's why you have the perspective of looking out broader and taking a longer time frame.
And the employees love the defined benefit plans because that's the only thing they'd really experienced.
It's all they ever knew. But
yeah.
also the company is taking a lot of risk in this.
Yeah.
And if the employee does it, then the employee have to begin to manage their own future, their own retirement. And that's very foreign to a lot of people.
So we've been talking a lot about you know, the public company issues here and so forth. And we have a significant representation from the Private Directors Association group in the room. You recently pivoted and did an incredible amount of work with a private company here in town, the Estes Funeral Chapel, that I don't know if many people in the audience really know about that. You helped to rescue the oldest black-owned business in Minneapolis. So can you tell us the story about that?
Well, yeah, I feel that there are very few people in this world that have been as fortunate as I have with the parents I've had and the opportunities that I've had. And you want, I mean, yeah, with the funeral home, when I talked about this, I gave the commencement address at business school a few months ago. And I talked about the whole issue of funeral is very ethnic. And in the black community, when young people realize that their parents have gone through tremendous hardship to get them where they are. And their thing is to give them a nice send-off. And they do that with a nice funeral. Well, that's not how I would want to do it. What I've done for my parents is I have a fellowship at Harvard Business School, and it's for students of color. And it throws off $100,000 a year for help with scholarships. So when I get these wonderful letters from students and families, that makes me think about my parents. And I also do a lot of mentoring, but the funeral home thing came up totally differently. There's a woman named April Estes who owns it. Her husband went to mortuary school, I want to say in California, I believe, and he came to the Twin Cities and wanted to start a funeral home business. He had no capital, no money, and so he worked at the airport as a skycap. And whenever a body was available, he had the arrangement he could leave, embalm, and come back. And it took him years to save enough money to build a business. Then he get in his older age, he has severe diabetes. He's on dialysis, very, very sick. There are some people managing his business, or I would say not managing it. And the business was in horrible shape. And the building they were about to be shut down by the county. And my wife knows April, and she mentioned, she's in a women's group, and she mentioned it's about to be shut down. And these women all vote. They don't know me, but they vote I should help her figure out what to do with it. So I walk in the house, and there are about 5 women there with my wife, and they say, we voted, you should help her figure out what to do with this. And I got started, and I had no idea what to do. But the problem was I couldn't quite let it go because the community needed it so much, and that I could sense right away. So to make a long story short, what eventually, I talked to lots of people, and I heard a lot of different things. And I got to know a man named Michael Noonan, who managed all the building for Hennepin County. Now, this is important because if you have a block, and I'd say 80% of that block is held by North Point Health and Wellness. The other 20% right behind is owned by the funeral home. And North Point is just bursting at the seams. So they would love to have had her building just torn it down and expanded. So I worked with them to quantify what their options were. Now, in order she wanted to stay on the same, it's the intersection of Penn and Plymouth, which is a really great intersection in North Minneapolis. There was one place that she could be, but there had been a gas station there. So to remediate the land and do all those things was like a $6 million cost. So the Hennepin County couldn't justify $6 million for that. But as we went through their options, the one option was to take her building and tear it down. That cost X. Another one was to just move and take the whole facility somewhere else. That's the second option. A third option is to have employees there, but employees somewhere else. So your people are split. So when you analyze them all, spending $6 million for her was the cheapest alternative. So working Hennepin County through that, they agreed to do that. So then April had employees who were really not very good. In fact, we got a Medtronic person who actually went out and gave me some help on this one because I wanted some accounting help, looking at some of the accounting. But at any rate, I told April, who owns it, I said, April, what we really ought to do is find someone who knows how to build funeral homes. Because given that Hennepin County is going to be paying for it, they're going to pick whoever they want. And you're not going to get a person who really knows how to do that. So I said, but why don't we, without telling the county what we're doing, let's find who we want. And then once they're at the point of being ready, then we'll throw our option on the table. So we did a lot of interviews, and we found a firm in Wilmer, Minnesota called Terwisha Construction that does nothing but funeral homes and veterinary clinics. I'm not sure that I know the link, but those are the two things they do. And So then when Hennepin County got ready, well, we persuaded them to do that. We found a wonderful architect, a young African-American man who graduated from the University of Minnesota School of Architecture. And then I said, well, let's also find, I've never worked as an engineer, but technology is so key. We hired a firm called Technology by Design to design all the technology before ground was broken. And so to make a long story short, they have an absolutely beautiful state-of-the-art funeral home. And the architect said, I don't want a place that's a rectangle or a square building. I want something with lots of big windows that's airy, that you're celebrating a person that's leaving, you're not crying about the person that's passed away. So this all went incredibly well, and the building itself is beautiful. April herself had to borrow $1 million to do the inside of the building. But when you consider how much was spent to build it, that wasn't a lot. So then I kind of thought my job was finished, and every time I would try to back out, April would cry, and I would end up staying. So the building came alive 8 or 9 months before George Floyd's funeral. And people from out of town, they are just blown away by the quality of the funeral home. And in fact, Al Sharpton, all the people that you see in New York who came down, Estes handled the Floyd funeral. And the community loves this so much that the day that George Floyd was shot, residents of North Minneapolis sat in the parking lot all night to be sure nobody touched it or harmed it. So all of this happened, and then I had to get more involved on the financial side, because April had people working for her that I could never prove in court, but you get a sense for these things that just were not handling money the way it should. I'm trying to sound nice. I don't want to say stealing, but that was basically where we're getting. And so basically, I convinced April that she had to terminate some people, which she did. And instantly, cash flow has gone up. And the business has done really well. And we worked out an arrangement for her to sell the business. She's 92 years old now. And I think that's going to happen within a few months. But the business is doing incredibly well. And when all of this started, she said, there's no way I can ever pay back $1 million. Well, that's not even an issue, a problem now.
Great.
And this was really interesting because every graduate of the Harvard Business School has a podcast on this, which is really, I think you've heard it. When I got a call from the dean of the business school, and he said, Bob, every year we award 2 or 3 distinguished alumni awards, and you are one this year. And he said, tell me what you've done. And I went through 52 years is a long time. And I was in the class of 1970. And at the end, I said, oh, and by the way, I worked in a funeral home. He said, well, tell me about it. And I told him, he said, if you think of the world as have and have-nots, at Harvard Business School, we are training people to go out and help the people who already have. He said, this is something to help the people who didn't. And I'd like to see the school do more of this. So in conjunction with this award, they sent 2 people out to visit Sharon and I. And it was a photographer and a writer. And as they left, they said, we'd like to see the funeral home from the outside. So I said, fine. Well, then they said, we'd like to call and talk to the owner. So they called and talked to April. Then they called back and said, we'd like to talk to the architect. So they did that. And then April called and said, Bob, I was on the phone with them for over an hour. And I said, I can't imagine what they would talk about for an hour. Well, what they ended up is they did a podcast, which was given to all the students in the graduate class.
I had the opportunity to listen to that podcast thanks to Bob kind of steering me toward it, and it's really an amazing story. And perhaps as a follow-up, we'll shoot out the link to the Harvard Business School podcast so folks can learn more about that if that's something you have an interest in. I think it's time for audience questions, and so
I have a few questions for you.
Okay.
Okay. First question is, what advice would you give to those who are interested in finding their first board role?
Well, I think a lot depends on the size of the company, what the company does, and all those sorts of things. But I think the job of serving on a board is different now than it was back in 1990 when I went on TECO Energy's board. Because all they cared about was, this very narrow thing about tax, and you can sit on the audit committee. And that's all they wanted. Today, you can't do that. Today, I'll give you a strategy example. HP was just such a mess so much of the time, but we had, at one point, I mentioned this to George, we had, HP had a building, and I want to say it's in Cupertino, but somewhere in California, that they said we don't need, we're going to sell. all we went through was the financial implication of selling it. It was a gain, and all of that looked great. Well, later we found that basically the building was bought by Apple, and Apple bought it to house software engineers. And if you look at it today, I mean, you look at your phone, your iPad, or anything, look at there are apps everywhere. I mean, software, and that's the one weakness that HP had and still had. And that really hit me a year or so later when IBM and HP and others bid on work for Citi. And when they presented to the board, who won? Citi's glaring weakness, or HP's glaring weakness was lack of software. So anyway, to come back to your question, I think people who want to be on boards today, I think it's the kind of CFO to go on a board. And not every CFO is going to be a great candidate to do that. And I want to go back to when I was with Medtronic. Medtronic did something I'm amazed that more companies don't do. And it was how they managed finance talent within the company. And there was an organization called FLDC. Now, I've been gone from Medtronic. I retired in 2005, so I don't know. I'm not exactly sure what's done now. And this was there long before I was CFO. It's where they defined 6 skills that you had to have. Things like partnering and working with management, things like accounting knowledge, things like technology. So you lay those things out. Then you would evaluate careers in 3 phases. One is when you first start. So when you first start, it's all the technical things you have to know. Then it's in the middle phase, it's really partnering and working with the people in the business that you're opposite. And then the third one is really kind of being a leader. And then kind of the litmus test you have is a good CFO today, and again, depends on the kind of company, is one who in many ways can almost speak for the CEO. When I became CFO at Medtronic, one of the things that Bill wanted, and he was much more, he knew more about what he wanted than I was thinking about what the company needed. But Bill, Medtronic was covered by more than 20 analysts. It would take all of his time to just speak at analyst conferences. So he's got to have somebody that you can turn loose to do that. And if you turn somebody loose and they give you the wrong earnings estimate numbers, or they say something stupid, I mean, you've got lots of shareholder value down the tubes and somebody who's out of a job. So that's the litmus test kind of CFO that you want.
So strategy, and don't give the wrong earnings number.
Yeah, but it's not just, I mean, the things that you have to, I mean, CFO, particularly of a big multinational company, is a very big and very complicated job. I can remember every Monday morning at Medtronic, we would have a management committee. And we were in once, and one of our competitors had announced they were going to do something. Well, Bill decided, let me hold this, let's have a 3-4 hour meeting, let's talk about this. Well, all of a sudden, I'm on tap. Well, do you think the company can do this? Compare us, the company with St. Jude, compare us to them. What are our strengths, their strengths? How likely are they to do this? How should we respond to that? So you got to know a lot about your company and the competitor's company. There's a lot you have to know.
How important is it to understand and to be able to articulate about the things that you as a board candidate can bring to a board?
But I think anybody who looks at you, they're going to want to know that. And they're going to want to know, depending on the kind of company, can you do the kind of things that I've just talked about? I mean, they just, Stanley Black Decker, Jim Lurie was the CEO, and Jim, now Don Allen, who was the CFO, has now become the CEO. And they were almost like, I don't want to say exactly interchangeable, but there's so many times that we would have a question for Jim, who was the CEO. He'd say, well, let Don talk about that. They were together a lot. And you got to convince someone that you're that kind of that you could become that kind. You're intellectually curious, and I think nothing beats liking the industry that you're working with.
Bob, one of the things that we hear a lot in thinking about preparing to serve on a board is that there's one resume that you might have, or one bio you might have from a management perspective for the next management role. But your bio to serve on a board would be very different than the bio that you would have from a management perspective. because it would emphasize those strategic issues,
Yeah.
the critical thinking issues, those sorts of things, as opposed to necessarily the management. What's your take on that?
Well, I guess I think beneath all that, I want to look through to the kind of person that it is, and what their character is. And I had a lot of things that I didn't do so well, and there were a couple of times, as you've heard me say, where I would say for myself. I mean, I had an idea of doing something, but the one thing I did is I learned how to work well with people, and I learned how to be intellectually curious and dig in, and I'll tell you, and serving on a board is a tough job. I mean, in that, you think of this, think if you get 9 high-level people who have been highly successful, and I would also add highly opinionated for the most part, and you put a problem out there, and if you got 8 people, you're likely to get 8 definitions of the problem. And you got to understand how to meld that into something that's going to be common. So a lot of it's how you deal with people, how you think about issues, and a lot of that is hard. You only get by talking to a person and understanding.
It's not on any piece of paper.
Yeah, and I kind of felt like when I was at Union, Texas, Bill Gates was the chair of the company, and I said, why would he want me as controller of this company? I'm not a CPA. The guy who was there was a CPA. And if you want to get into entries on T accounts, he could run ring circles around me. At least I thought he could. But my point being, I think Bill saw something in me that maybe he thought I could do that job. And Bill George said the same thing when I came to Medtronic.
Very good. How are we doing on time?
Well, we're a little bit after.
Okay.
We have time for one more. What do you think? We're just about 5 minutes over.
Let's do one more quick then.
This is an interesting question. How do you view balance between shareholders' objectives versus ESG objectives?
And ESG meaning?
Environmental, social, governance. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure how to answer, because I think you don't look at just maximizing earnings. And I think you have to have some conscience about what the company does. And that's how I would come at it. But again, I would tell you that from KKR to Medtronic, KKR, I learned so much. George Roberts, I think, was one of the most brilliant people I've ever dealt with. And they were tough, and they took think about this, laying off a third of your workforce in a day. We pushed and did very difficult things. But then I come to Medtronic, and Medtronic is a company that has this tremendous mission that really cares about people and and that's what I love the most about Medtronic. And the thing that I miss more than anything, I don't miss 7 a.m. meetings, 6:30 a.m. meetings, but I do miss a lot going to the operating room. I used to do that a lot, and I would scrub down and stand within feet of surgeons, and they love to explain what they're doing. And I've seen I've seen heart transplants, I've seen brain surgery, I've done lots of pacemakers. I found that, and you have a great feeling about what the company does.
Wow.
I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Well, we're over time, and I could have this conversation go on for hours and hours and hours, and never get tired. So I want to say thank you, Bob, for sharing your experiences with us. I want to thank the audience, the in-person audience here, as well as our virtual audience that's online at this point. Also want to be sure and thank our sponsors and strategic partners. If you're in the audience here and you want CPE, you need to sign in and sign out at the front. And Nancy Ellers, thank you so much for handling the CPE questions online for our virtual folks. In terms of future FEI and PDA meetings, November 1st is Professional Development Focus, Challenges of the CFO. It's a breakfast event, 4 one-hour CPE sessions. You can come for one, you can come for all 4. November 3, we have a women's pickleball event. So we're not just boring accountants, we like to have fun too. Then November 16th is also going to be another great event, Leadership at Performance Level. is the title for the event. It features a best-selling author and podcast host, Curtis Zimmerman. If you have questions about that, see Brad. We're going to have another, huge room for that. So I think that's really going to be a great event. On the PDA front, on October 19th, financing options and important director questions. If you have questions about that, I'm a PDA board member in addition to being an FEI board member, so I'd be happy to answer questions about that. So in closing, Bob, thank you once again. We're delighted to offer an honorarium to thank you for the time you spent helping us all get up to speed on navigating the boardroom. Can you share with us who you think that honorarium
absolutely. The honorarium is to the Ascension School.
Okay.
You heard me talk about me going to Catholic school. I have a picture, which would be 75 years old now, me as a 5-year-old in a Catholic school with nuns on each end and the class in the middle. And it was a wonderful experience. I learned so much. And so Ascension is in North Minneapolis. And my wife is on the board of Ascension. And we're contributors to Ascension, and they do a wonderful job with children whose parents can't afford. And what I said to Patty Sullivan, who runs it, I said, boy, if the parents could understand, and this is one of the things I'd like to help them do, is talk to the parents, because if parents can understand what this place can do for their children, they should be beating the doors down to get their children in.
Yeah. Well, please join me in giving a round of applause for Bob Black.
Yes. I would just say thanks for having me. Whenever I have to talk to anyone that's not about a financial presentation, you never know whether you have anything to say until you start to talk.
Thanks once again.